Nina Harper walked into the courthouse, her steps slow, but determined. The air felt heavy with the weight of the day. She had long learned to carry the burden of small injustices and petty inconveniences that came with life in a town where her presence was often overlooked. She was here for a simple traffic violation, a ticket that should have been a mere formality, but as she approached the counter and stood before the judge, her calm exterior hid a simmering frustration. Her brown eyes carefully observed everything: the walls, the people, the judge sitting on his raised platform looking down on her, as if she were nothing more than a faceless name on a piece of paper. Judge Harold Thompson glanced at her briefly, barely lifting his eyes from the ticket in front of him. Nana could tell immediately that he was dismissing her based on his own prejudices. He had seen people like her before, people from the working class who didn't fit the mold of those who came to court with polished clothes and expensive lawyers. He didn't bother to even look at her properly or take her in as a person. No, he had already made up his mind about who she was before she even spoke. He cleared his throat and began to read out her offense as though he had read the same script hundreds of times before, his voice flat and unfeeling. Nana stood still, her hands clasped in front of her, trying to remain composed. The judge's words felt like a distant hum to her. She had been here before, not in this exact court, but in similar situations. Her entire life seemed to have been a series of such encounters where her worth was questioned simply because of the color of her skin, her background, her appearance. But Nana was no stranger to the system. She knew how it worked. She knew how people like the judge saw her, and how easily they dismissed her when they didn't recognize her value or her strength. Judge Thompson's voice grew louder as he laid out the fine and the consequences of not paying it on time, a hefty sum that felt far too high for a simple mistake. And Nana felt her chest tighten. She had expected it. She knew the drill, but it didn't make it any easier. She had worked hard her entire life, doing everything she could to stay afloat, to build a life that meant something. But in this moment, none of that seemed to matter, because all the judge saw was a woman in front of him, a woman who didn't fit the image of someone worthy of understanding or empathy. As the judge concluded his speech, he looked at Nina with a look of finality. His decision made, there was no room for negotiation. He barely even spared her a glance as he asked if she had anything to say. Nana felt the weight of his gaze, the judgment in his eyes. But she didn't respond. She simply shook her head, her lips pressed together in quiet defiance. She wasn't going to argue with him. Not now, not in this room. She had learned that sometimes it was better to stay silent and walk away with your dignity intact, even if the system didn't care for it. She turned to leave the courtroom, the sound of her heels echoing in the silence behind her, and as she stepped into the hallway, she felt a flicker of something deeper inside her, a realization that perhaps this moment would not be the end of the story, not for her and not for anyone who had been overlooked or dismissed simply because they didn't fit into someone else's narrow view of the world. Nina stepped out of the courtroom and into the narrow hallway, her breath steady, but her mind racing. She could feel the weight of the fine pressing down on her shoulders. But that wasn't what troubled her the most. What stung was the way the judge had treated her, not even bothering to truly see her. His judgment was quick, his eyes dismissive, as if she was just another nameless figure in a world of faceless people. She could feel the sting of his assumptions. It was a familiar feeling, one she had lived with for most of her life, being seen for what others thought she was instead of who she truly was. She walked past the security guards and the people filing in and out of the courtroom, but none of them seemed to notice her. They were too busy with their own lives, too wrapped up in their own stories. But Nina couldn't help but wonder how many of them had been treated the same way, how many had stood before someone who had judged them before they even had the chance to speak, before they had even shown who they were. Nina wasn't angry, not yet at least, but she felt a deep ache inside, a quiet frustration that she knew would eventually grow louder if left unchecked. Outside the courthouse, the sun was shining brightly, but Nina barely noticed the warmth on her skin. Her thoughts were consumed with what had just happened. She wasn't just another person with a ticket to pay. She was Nina Harper, an artist, a woman who had spent years of her life creating powerful work that spoke to the struggles and triumphs of Black communities. Her art had been showcased in galleries across the world. Her name had become synonymous with activism and change. But none of that seemed to matter in that courtroom to the judge. She was just a woman who had made a mistake and needed to pay the price. Her mind wandered back to her work and the years she had spent dedicating herself to causes she believed in, but it had all come with a price. Nina had long ago stepped away from the spotlight, not because she had stopped caring, but because she had realized that sometimes the most powerful change happened in quiet spaces where her voice could be heard without the noise of the world drowning it out. She had focused on community building, on mentorship, and on teaching young people the importance of finding their own voices in a world that constantly tried to silence them. But now, as she walked through the busy streets of her town, she couldn't help but feel a sense of loss, a loss for what she had given up and what she had been forced to hide behind. In order to survive the constant battle for respect and acknowledgement, she had never expected to be celebrated, not in the way that some artists or activists were, but she had hoped for a basic level of understanding for her work and the impact it had made. It wasn't fame she craved, it was recognition for the truth in her work and for the change she had fought for every day of her life. As she continued to walk, her thoughts shifted from frustration to something else, something more hopeful. She realized that this moment, the moment with the judge, wasn't the end of the story. It couldn't be. There had to be more to this Nina Harper's story than a simple fine and a courtroom encounter. There was power in her silence, in the way she had left the courtroom with her head held high. There was power in what she had been doing all these years, quietly shaping the world around her. Even when the world didn't seem to notice, perhaps now was the time for others to see her, not as a woman caught in a system that overlooked her, but as the woman who had quietly been making waves in her own way all along. Ellis Carter was no stranger to the courthouse. As a local reporter, he had covered his fair share of trials, small-town disputes, and minor legal matters, but there was something different about the woman he had just seen leave the courtroom. He had been in the back, scribbling notes for an article on a property dispute, when he caught sight of Nina Harper walking out. He didn't recognize her at first, but there was something about her presence, an air of quiet defiance that made him pause. It was the kind of thing that lingered long after someone had left the room. He had to know who she was. Ellis had always prided himself on knowing the faces of people who mattered in town, the ones whose stories had depth and meaning. He had seen her before in passing, but the weight of her name hadn't quite registered. That changed when his mind clicked into place, and suddenly everything about Nina's presence became clear. Nina Harper. The name sounded like something from a history book, something important but distant, like the echoes of an older, forgotten legacy. He'd heard whispers of her once, back when he first arrived in town, but the stories had always been vague. He had no idea that she was the same woman he had just seen before Judge Thompson. Nina Harper wasn't just anyone. She was an artist of great renown, a social activist whose work had transcended galleries and art shows. She had painted portraits that spoke of the Black experience, captured moments of grace, struggle, and beauty, and through her work had challenged the world to rethink its perceptions of race, culture, and identity. Her art had inspired people, and her activism had moved communities. But lately, she had faded from the spotlight, choosing to live a quieter life, away from the media and the public eye. Yet, even in her absence, her impact was undeniable. Ellis had to get the story. He felt it in his gut. There was something profound about how she had carried herself today, how she had silently endured the judge's harsh words. It wasn't just the fine, it was the way she had been treated, as though her presence meant nothing, as though her lifetime of work was invisible in that room. There was a story to be told here, one that would shed light on not just Nina's life, but on the town's tendency to overlook those who were truly shaping the world around them. That night, Ellis dug into Nina's background. He pored over old articles, interviews, and exhibits. What he uncovered sent a ripple through him. Nina Harper had been an activist long before it became a popular thing to stand up for justice. She had marched for civil rights, raised her voice for social change, and created art that spoke to generations of Black men and women who had been marginalized. Her work had opened eyes, changed minds, and given strength to those who had none. Yet somehow she had slipped through the cracks in this town, the place that had once been the backdrop for so much of her creative journey. By the time Ellis sat down to write his article, he felt a deep responsibility. He wasn't just writing about a traffic violation anymore. He was writing about how a woman who had once been a force for change had been reduced to nothing more than a case number in a courtroom. He wanted the world to know who Nina Harper was, the woman who had painted stories of history and hope, the woman who had stood for something bigger than a speeding ticket. The headline he chose was simple but powerful. Asterisk judge finds local cultural icon without knowing her true legacy. Asterisk, the article would go out the next morning, but Ellis knew that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Nina's story was far from over. The morning after Ellis published his article, the town was abuzz. The local newspaper, once a modest voice for the community, now had a piece that everyone was talking about. Nina Harper's name was on the front page, and not just because of a minor traffic violation, but because of her monumental influence. The article painted a picture of Nina as more than a woman caught in an ordinary traffic stop. It revealed her as a cultural icon, an artist whose work had resonated far beyond the borders of this small town. People who had once walked past her without a second glance were suddenly asking themselves who this woman really was. Ellis had done his research thoroughly. The article delved into Nina's art, how her paintings, rich with the colors and struggles of the Black experience, had been showcased in galleries across the globe. It spoke of her early work in the civil rights movement, her involvement in numerous charities, and her commitment to mentoring young artists. Nina Harper was not some obscure figure who had faded from the public eye. She was, and still was, a force in the world of art and activism. But it wasn't just the accolades or her artistic achievements that were compelling, it was the irony. The woman who had spent her life fighting for justice, equality, and the dignity of marginalized communities had been treated as if she were just another person to be fined and forgotten. The stark contrast between her legacy and the judge's dismissal hit a nerve, and soon social media was flooded with reactions. People from all over the country, some who had seen her art, some who had simply heard of her work, began to share their stories. One woman posted a picture of a painting Nina had done decades ago, showing a powerful depiction of the Civil Rights March in Selma. The caption read, "Asterisk, this painting inspired me to become an activist. I've never met her, but I've always felt her presence." Asterisk. Another user shared an old interview where Nina discussed the importance of creating space for Black voices in art. The comments exploded with praise for Nina, and many expressed their disbelief that someone with such a rich history of contribution could be so easily disregarded. Meanwhile, Nina herself was shocked by the outpouring of support. She had never sought the spotlight in recent years, having distanced herself from the media to focus on community-based projects. But now she realized how much her work had truly impacted people, how deeply her silence had been misunderstood. It was a strange feeling, being thrust back into the public eye after so many years of stepping back. Her phone rang constantly. Messages flooded in. Most were words of admiration and support, while others were questions. Asterisk, why didn't you tell us who you were? Asterisk, why didn't you ever speak up before? Asterisk, it was overwhelming, and at first, Nina wasn't sure how to respond. She had always felt more comfortable behind her work, letting the art speak for her rather than herself. But now, it was impossible to ignore the fact that the world had finally seen her, even if it had come in the most unexpected and painful way. In the midst of all this, Ellis reached out to her. He had covered the story because it was his job, but now he felt a personal responsibility to ensure that Nina's truth was fully understood, not just for the sake of a good article, but because he believed in her story. He knew the fallout from the judge's dismissal could be huge, and he wanted to give Nina the platform to share her side. Ellis asked if she would meet him for an interview, a chance to speak directly to the people who had just learned of her. Nina, after a long moment of contemplation, agreed. She knew it was time for her to speak, not out of anger, but to ensure that her voice, her art, and her purpose were no longer silenced. And so, in the coming days, the second chapter of Nina Harper's story began to unfold, this time not in a courtroom or behind a canvas, but in the hearts and minds of everyone who had heard her name for the first time. As the days passed, the town became a place of constant conversation. The story of Nina Harper, once buried in history, had resurfaced with a force that left people reeling. It was no longer just about the fine or the judge's misstep. It was about how a community had failed to recognize one of its most powerful figures. The more Nina's name spread across news outlets and social media, the more the people of the town began to reflect on their own ignorance. The very streets they walked, the buildings they passed, the coffee shops they frequented, many of them had been unknowingly shaped by Nina's quiet influence over the years. Local businesses that had once ignored her quietly began to display her artwork in their windows. A small gallery that had barely existed a few months ago began to showcase pieces of hers, pieces that had been tucked away in storage, gathering dust. At the same time, there was a noticeable shift in attitude. People who had never taken the time to get to know Nina now approached her in the streets, asking questions about her work and her life. Some apologized for never truly seeing her. The uncomfortable realization that they had been complicit in overlooking someone so impactful began to settle into the collective conscience of the community. But it wasn't just the ordinary townsfolk who were waking up to Nina's importance. The local activists, who had been fighting for years for justice and recognition, took this moment to speak up as well. They, too, had been overlooked, and they recognized the profound impact of Nina's activism, even if it had been silent for a long time. In rallies and meetings, they began to mention Nina's name with reverence, citing her contributions to their movements. Nina's work had inspired them in their own fights for equality, and now they wanted to ensure she received the acknowledgement she deserved. There were those who remained silent. Judge Thompson, for one, had not yet commented on the growing wave of support for Nina. His silence spoke volumes. People began to question his integrity, wondering how he could have so thoroughly dismissed someone of Nina's caliber. But for many, the issue wasn't just about the judge. It was about the system that allowed such dismissals to happen in the first place. People began to ask themselves if Nina's mistreatment was a sign of something much deeper, something systemic. The conversation was no longer just about Nina or the judge. It was about the larger issues of bias, privilege, and racial injustice that permeated every level of society. The town had never been the same since the article had come out. In town meetings, the topic of race was no longer whispered about behind closed doors. It was being openly discussed, acknowledged, and for the first time in a long while, the community felt a strange sense of unity, not just about Nina, but about a shared responsibility to do better. Local news outlets picked up on the story's wider implications, publishing editorials about the deep-seated problems in the judicial system and how often people like Nina, Black women, artists, activists, were overlooked in favor of more traditional figures. The more the story spread, the clearer it became that Nina Harper was not just an individual to be admired. She was a symbol of everything that had been wrong with how the community and the world treated those who were different. As the town grappled with these revelations, the people who had once turned a blind eye began to make amends in their own ways. An art exhibit was organized in Nina's honor, showcasing her works and telling the story of her influence on the community. The mayor, once distant, publicly invited Nina to be part of an advisory board to help elevate art programs for underrepresented communities. Conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion took center stage in town meetings, and people began to realize that Nina's story wasn't just a personal one. It was one that reflected a much larger narrative. Yet, through all of this, Nina remained somewhat removed, watching quietly from the sidelines. She had never craved the spotlight, and even now, as the town clamored to make up for past wrongs, she felt no rush to rejoin the fray. Instead, she used the attention as an opportunity to shift the focus from her to others, other artists, other marginalized voices who needed to be heard. It was in her nature to uplift others, and she knew that her real work was not in being acknowledged, but in helping the community that had so long forgotten the value of voices like hers. As the days turned into weeks, Nina Harper found herself standing at a crossroads. The whirlwind of media attention and community support had been overwhelming, and while part of her was grateful for the recognition, another part longed for the quiet of her former life. She had always been someone who worked in the shadows, creating art and pushing boundaries without expecting praise. But now, that silence had been broken, and the weight of everyone's expectations was palpable. The town had woken up to her legacy, but Nina wasn't sure how to reconcile this newfound attention with the life she had chosen to live, one of purpose but behind the scenes. Despite the inner conflict, Nina knew that something had changed within her. The town's response to the article, the artwork displayed in galleries, and the conversations about race and justice were all signs that something larger was happening, something that needed to continue. She could no longer remain on the sidelines. Her story had become a catalyst, and the community's willingness to confront its own biases, however uncomfortable, was an opportunity she could not ignore. A few weeks after Ellis's article was published, the mayor of the town reached out to Nina, inviting her to an official town meeting. There, she would be asked to share her thoughts on how the local art scene could better reflect the diversity of its people and how the town could create space for more voices like hers, voices that had long been marginalized. Nina hesitated at first, unsure of how to navigate this new world of political recognition, but after a long conversation with her closest friends, she realized that her voice could be a bridge, a way to transform the conversation from one of guilt and reaction to one of growth and opportunity. On the day of the meeting, Nina entered the town hall with a quiet sense of purpose. The room was filled with local leaders, artists, and community members, all gathered to discuss the future of the town. They had seen the impact of the article, heard the conversations bubbling up across social media, and now they wanted to listen to Nina. As she took her seat at the front, she could feel the eyes of the room on her. But this time, it wasn't judgment. It was curiosity, respect, and a bit of trepidation, an acknowledgement that things were about to change. The mayor, a man in his 50s who had always kept a professional distance from Nina, introduced her as a local treasure and a cultural icon. There was a brief moment of applause, and Nina nodded her head in acknowledgement, but she felt a pang of discomfort. These words, while kind, didn't quite capture the fullness of who she was. She wasn't just an artist or an icon. She was a woman who had lived and worked in the margins, who had fought quietly for change, even when it seemed like no one was watching. When it was her turn to speak, Nina stood up and cleared her throat. She had prepared no speech, only a few notes scribbled in a small notebook. She took a moment to look around the room, letting the silence settle before speaking. "Thank you for having me here," she began, her voice steady but carrying a weight of experience. "I spent a lot of years thinking about how to make a difference, how to create change in a world that often refuses to listen. I've painted pictures, organized, mentored young people. But what I've learned is that change doesn't come in one big moment. It comes in thousands of small moments, in actions that go unnoticed, in conversations like the one we're having today." She paused, scanning the room. The faces were attentive, waiting for her next words. Art, culture, and justice are not separate. They're intertwined, and we've all seen that in the past few weeks. People in this town are waking up to the fact that there are voices we've ignored. Artists, activists, people who've been part of this community for years but have never been seen. What I want from this town, what I want from all of us, is to remember that it's not enough to admire art once it's been acknowledged. We need to make space for it. We need to create opportunities for people to express themselves, to build new platforms, and to listen when the people who've been silenced finally speak. Her words landed with a quiet power, and Nina could see the shift in the room. People were no longer just seeing her as the woman who had been mistreated in court. They were seeing her as the force she had always been, the one who had quietly fought for change, the one who had been creating art and fostering community in a world that often overlooked her. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about all of them, about all the voices that had been left behind, about all the ways in which they could begin to make things right. The meeting ended with a renewed sense of purpose. Nina was asked to lead a new initiative, one that would amplify underrepresented voices in the arts and provide platforms for young artists of color. For the first time in a long while, Nina felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new, a future where her work, and the work of so many like her, wouldn't be forgotten again. The town's collective awakening did not happen overnight, nor did the shift in Nina Harper's life feel immediate. It took time for the new initiative to gain momentum, But the conversations that had started in that town hall meeting began to ripple outward, slowly but surely changing the way the community viewed art, culture, and its own history. Nina's role in this transformation had become central, not just as an artist, but as a mentor, a catalyst for change, and a beacon of the quiet power that comes with dedication to one's purpose. At first, it was the smaller changes that caught her attention. The gallery that had initially displayed a few of her paintings now opened its doors to more artists from diverse backgrounds. The local library hosted an exhibit showcasing the works of Black artists, with Nina's art taking center stage. It wasn't just about honoring her, it was about giving a platform to voices that had long been silenced. The initiative Nina had helped spearhead began funding scholarships for young artists of color, creating opportunities for them to travel, to study, and to grow in their craft without the heavy burden of financial strain. As the months passed, the initiatives began to snowball. The town that had once felt like a place of quiet neglect had become a hub for artistic expression, a place where diversity wasn't just celebrated in words, but lived out through action. The town saw its first ever Black History Month art gala, where Nina's paintings told stories of triumph, struggle, and beauty, reminding everyone who walked through those doors of the rich history that had been ignored for far too long. It was at the gala that Nina realized how much had changed, not just in the town, but within herself. She stood before a crowd of young faces, many of them artists, some of them activists, others simply curious. The room was buzzing with energy, an energy she hadn't felt in years. It was a hum of potential, of voices eager to be heard. As she watched the crowd, Nina felt the weight of the past months, of the fine, of the judge's indifference, of the article that had forced the town to see her. But most of all, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the people who had now made this space possible, who had begun to rewrite the narrative not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked. In the weeks leading up to the gala, she had been working closely with a group of students from the local high school, mentoring them in art and activism. These students had come from all walks of life, some from families who had lived in the town for generations, others from more recent immigrant backgrounds. It was these students who had begun to grasp the message Nina had been imparting. That art was not just for the elite, and activism was not just for those in the spotlight. Art was for the people, and activism was about bringing about real, tangible change. On the night of the gala, she watched as one of her students, a young woman named Layla, stood nervously in front of the crowd, ready to present her own artwork. Layla had never imagined herself as an artist. She had always thought her talents weren't important enough, that her voice wasn't loud enough. But Nina had encouraged her, pushed her to see the power in her own expression. And now Layla's painting, a striking image of resilience, showing the faces of Black women throughout history, was being admired by dozens of people. As Layla spoke about her work, Nina felt a quiet pride in her heart. She had done more than just teach her to paint. She had given her the tools to find her own voice, to understand that her story mattered. The gala ended with a standing ovation for the artists, for the community, and for Nina herself. The applause was heartfelt, but it wasn't the applause that meant the most to Nina. It was the feeling in the air, the sense of possibility, of real change unfolding before her eyes. Later that evening, as Nina walked home through the quiet streets of the town, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The quiet battle she had waged for recognition had given way to something greater, a movement, a community, a future where voices like hers and like Layla's would never be silenced again. In that moment, Nina knew she had finally found her place, not in the shadows, but in the heart of the community that had once overlooked her. And that, she realized, was the true power of her art. The transformation in Nina Harper's life and in the town continued to unfold with each passing day. The gallery that had once barely acknowledged her work was now a thriving cultural center, consistently filled with art from Black and marginalized artists. Local students, many of whom had never considered pursuing a career in the arts, began flocking to the newly established arts programs, eager to learn, create, and find their own voices in the work of others who had shared similar struggles. Nina, however, never sought the spotlight for herself. She remained deeply committed to the initiatives she had helped establish, knowing that her role was not to be at the center of the conversation, but to amplify the voices of the young artists and activists who were now shaping the future. Every day, she could feel the momentum building. Her mission was no longer just about being seen. It was about creating a lasting change, one that would live far beyond her own lifetime. One of the most significant milestones came when Nina was invited to speak at a national art conference. The organizers had heard about her work in the town and the initiatives she had started, and they wanted her to discuss how communities could use art as a tool for social change. It was a humbling invitation, one that she had never imagined receiving. But as much as Nina felt honored, she also felt a tinge of hesitation. She had always stayed away from the national stage, preferring to keep her efforts close to home. Yet this invitation represented an opportunity to push her message even further, to share the lessons she had learned with people who might take them and spread them to communities across the country. Nina accepted the invitation, and in the months leading up to the conference, she poured her heart into preparing her speech. It wasn't just about her journey, it was about the lessons that communities, big and small, could take from her experience. She spoke of the power of art to heal, to inspire, and to challenge the status quo. She spoke of the importance of mentorship and creating spaces where the next generation of artists could thrive. She spoke of the quiet revolution that had happened in her own town, a revolution built not on grand gestures, but on small acts of recognition, support, and love. The night before her speech, Nina found herself reflecting on how far she had come. Years ago, she might have never imagined standing in front of a national audience, let alone addressing the topic of social justice through art. But the years of quiet work, the countless hours spent creating, teaching, and advocating had brought her to this moment. And while she had always resisted the idea of being seen as a leader or a symbol, she couldn't deny that her journey had inspired change, not just in her town, but in places far beyond it. The day of the conference, Nina took to the stage with a quiet confidence. Her speech was simple but powerful, and as she spoke, she could see the effect it was having on the audience. Heads nodded in agreement, eyes widened in understanding, and by the end of her presentation, there was a standing ovation. It was a recognition not just of Nina, but of the community that had rallied behind her, of the young artists whose work would now be seen, and of the future that was being built, one step at a time. As she left the stage, Nina felt a profound sense of peace. She had always believed that change came in small, quiet moments, moments that, when added together, could create something much larger than any one individual could achieve on their own. And as she returned home to her town, she knew that her work was far from finished. There would always be more to do, more artists to support, more systems to challenge. But for now, she could rest in the knowledge that the seeds of change she had planted had begun to bloom. Nina Harper had become more than just an artist. She had become a symbol of quiet resistance, of the power of art and activism to change the world, and of the importance of never giving up on what you believe in, even when no one else is watching. And in the end, she knew that her greatest legacy would be the people she had inspired and the voices that would continue to echo in her wake long after she was gone.